I am continuing in my reading. What I'm doing in this series is to read through the entire standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This consists of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. I am continuing reading in a chronological order, according to event, not according to publication or volume, so I'm skipping around a bit as I move along. So we are still reading in the Gospels. We are coming to the Passover, the final week of Christ's life and the atonement. We've been reading some great prophecies and parables of Christ as he teaches his apostles on the Mount of Olives just before Passover. He was teaching in the temple during the day, but he's come out and he's on the Mount of Olives, teaching his disciples, teaching the apostles. Now we're going to pick this up. In this video, we are going to read all three synoptic Gospels. And this will be our last video before the Last Supper. So this is, we're getting to the most crucial part of the whole story. In this video, we have a Joseph Smith translation. Now what the Joseph Smith translation is, this is a translation or correction done by Joseph Smith to restore those passages that have been lost or corrupted over the years. So first, we read in Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 to 16. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went unto the chief priests, and said unto them, What will ye give me? And I will deliver him unto you. And they covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver. And from that time he sought opportunity to betray him. Here we are getting the conspiracy of Judas Iscariot. He is going to the scribes, to the Pharisees, and agreeing to help them arrest Christ. Now, this is 30 pieces of silver, which is also a fulfillment of prophecy, and it parallels the story of Joseph of Egypt being sold into Egypt. Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver, which at the time was a standard value of a young slave. And now Christ is being sold for 30 pieces of silver, which would be the standard value of an adult slave. So the parallel is there. Now, the coins that they are talking about here are most likely the Greek stater. Now, staters were most often made of gold, but in New Testament times they were frequently made of silver as well. And they would be the equivalent of about 4 pennies, which would be the Roman denarius. So 30 pieces of silver would be approximately 120 pennies. Now, as Judas Iscariot said that Mary should have sold the ointment that she anointed Christ with, she could have sold it for 300 pence, which would have been 300 pennies. So he is agreeing to betray Christ for a little over 1/3 of the value of that ointment. Just a little comparison there. Of course, the Pharisees are all for this. And it said, note this, that they don't just agree, they covenanted. This is a binding legal agreement. So this is not just an agreement between friends. This is a binding agreement. Let us look at the Joseph Smith translation. In verse 15, again, we remove unto them. So it's just, and said, what will you give me? And then in verse 26, instead of betray him, it is betray Jesus. So minor grammatical corrections, nothing significant. So let us now look at Mark chapter 14, verses 10 and 11. And Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went unto the chief priests to betray him unto them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought how he might conveniently betray him. Much more simpler account, doesn't specify what kind of money he's going to get or how much, just going to be giving him money. And now he is seeking not just a means to betray him, but a convenient way to betray him. He's trying to find the easiest way. But there's not much there, so let us just quickly look at the Joseph Smith translation. This is very interesting. It actually takes both of these verses, and now they are no longer verses 10 and 11. They are transferred to be just after verse 28. Not much of a change in them, but it is interesting that Mark records this after the Last Supper. Now, this change, it's not shifted in the narrative in Matthew. I don't know about Luke yet, but it's interesting that it is shifted like this in Mark. Now, what it says, and I will probably read it again when I read in verse 28. But what it says here now is, Nevertheless, Judas Iscariot, even one of the 12, went unto the chief priests to betray Jesus unto them. For he turned away from him and was offended because of his words. And when the chief priests heard of him, they were glad and promised to give him money, and he sought how he might conveniently betray Jesus. The important thing to note there is that Judas is offended at what Christ says. Now, this is coming after Christ has declared that he is going to go die. And after he rises, he will see them again. So, well, just think about it a minute and remember that it is transposed in the narrative where it occurs. That's the main thing for this video, is that this portion actually comes later. And as I said, I will read it again when I read in verse 28. But for now, let us turn to Luke. Luke chapter 22, verses 1 through 6. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. Then entered Satan into Judas, surnamed Iscariot, being of the number of the 12. And he went his way and communed with the chief priests and captains, how he might betray him unto them. And they were glad, and covenanted to give him money. And he promised and sought opportunity to betray him unto them in the absence of the multitude. Remember, the Jews, or the Pharisees, the leaders, fear arresting Christ in public, because the people consider him a prophet. And so Judas is saying, remember, many times Christ goes off on his own with his 12 apostles into solitary places, places where they can be alone. What Judas is saying here is, look, I am one of the 12. I know where he goes, and I can lead you to him, and you can arrest him in secret. Where he's away from the multitudes, you won't have to fear the multitudes. That's the deal. It's not just that he's going to, everybody, they know who Christ is. They can arrest him any time, but Judas is going to show them where Christ will be when the multitudes aren't there. Other than that, everything else is basically the same, although it does state that Satan entered into Judas to form this plan. So, now I will point out also that Luke states that the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the Passover, is approaching. And that was the error that I made. But Luke is not a Jew. He is a Gentile. He is not even a Jew who converted. He is not even a Gentile who converted to Judaism and then converted to Christianity. He is just a Gentile who became a follower of Christ. So we forgive him that he doesn't know the nuanced differences between the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Because to the Gentiles it would seem as just one feast. It begins on the day of Passover and goes 8 days to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, we will look at the Joseph Smith translation of Luke here. In verse 2, instead of for they feared the people, it is but they feared the people. And in verse 6, it is now, and he promised them and sought opportunity. Minor grammatical changes, nothing of importance. Anyways, I'm going to leave that there, and in our next reading, we are going to read the Last Supper, but we're going to read it one gospel at a time, starting in Matthew. So I will see you there.